Okay, so you go in, you sit down, and you start arguing. This is, if you have not seen a Talmudic school, you need to watch Yentl. Okay, that gives you a great insight into Northern European Ashkenazic Jews in their Talmudic schools, and it gives you an idea of what's going on. Yes?
Just so you know, you weren't recording for about the first 6 minutes.
Okay. But we are now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, people who are just joining us. There was a little more, but I wrote the 2 sources on the board. I hope you can read those. So what you find in a Talmudic school, and now I've already forgotten where I'm going with that.
Revelation.
Whether there's revelation. Thank you very much, Kyle. They're arguing about something. And one side says, if this position is true, let the walls declare that. And the walls of the room lean in and say, this is what God thinks. And the other side says, excuse me, God, it's not your place anymore to tell us what to think. You have delivered your word. Now it is our job to find your word in the text. So no prophecy.
Thank you.
Yeah. That is shocking to us, right? To say, excuse me, God, your turn's over. Okay. But that's one of the midrashim, interesting stuff. So when we started class, we did this chart from Genesis 1 on the days of creation. If you didn't see that class, you can go back and watch it. It's recorded. But I said that you really only needed to remember 4 words in order to remember the entire chart. Light, water, land, and seed. And these go together because this is the 3rd day, right? Both of those go together. Now, there's a book that I read, I think I got it in about 1985. And it was out of print. So I borrowed it from some university on interlibrary loan. And there was nowhere to buy a copy in 85, right? Amazon did not exist. The internet didn't exist. And so I called up and said, how do I get a copy of this? And they said, it's so old. Copy anything you want. So I copied the entire book. Because that's what I wanted. And it's now back in print. So if you're interested in reading an extremely dense, meaning there's a lot of information on every page, and you need to be paying attention or you'll miss something important. That's part of where I got this. Although both the Jewish Theological Society Study Bible and the Jewish Publication Society Study Bible, there it is, in their footnotes will talk about the parallelism between day 1, day 2, day 3, and day 4, day 5, day 6. They won't go into it quite the detail I do, but they will point out that that is a very normative way to look at Genesis chapter 1, unless you're a new earth creationist, where you're trying to make it science. Because we usually don't use poetry, which is what this is, in physics classes, as a general rule. When I was in junior high, there was a boy who wrote me poetry, and it was all using math concepts.
That was romantic.
You know, I was glad he thought I'd understand. No, of course, it didn't go anywhere, but that's what people think I would be interested in. And I am, honestly. So Friedrich Weinrib was a rabbinic Jew from Holland who lived during World War II. If you go online, you will find some really opposing views on what this guy was doing during the war. Was he collaborating with the Nazis? I mean, they occupied Holland, and he's from Holland. Or was he working to keep Jews alive? It depends on how you want to read the situation. But at the end of the war, he said, 6 million Jewish scholars, and of course that's extreme, just died. And we have passed on the oral tradition for thousands of years. But 6 million voices were just stilled. We cannot leave it as an oral tradition any longer. We need to write this down so that even if we die, the truth, God's word, the oral traditions continue. And so there were people within his community who said, this is terrible, you're sharing all the secrets with people who aren't ready for them. See, you're not supposed to read some of the books of the Bible until you're at least 30. You want to know which two you're not allowed to read till you're 30? Yeah, you can guess one of them. Song of Songs. And Ezekiel. Okay? Not supposed to read those till you're at least 30, and you may only discuss them in the presence of one person. Now, how you interpret that, does that mean not with anybody? You are the one person? Or it's you and one other person? And there's debate about that. So it's kind of like these are the deeper mysteries, the theological heart of our beliefs. And of course, as Mormons, we don't even read Song of Songs. Now, I think that that's interesting to see those radically opposite views about the same book. And honestly, when you read Ezekiel, all anybody in the church reads is, there's 2 sticks, Joseph and Judah. Oh, and I think he talks about being fishers of men. That's about it, right? I'd love to hear from somebody who knows more about the book of Ezekiel.
The dry bones.
Dry bones, thank you, that's 3. You know, I was suggesting to our primary chorister, I'm in the primary presidency, that we should sing that song this year in primary. He had never heard it. We are losing our traditions, right? If you don't know Dry Bones, what other biblically based songs were you not taught? Did you not go to Bible school? You know, summer Bible school? I didn't, I lived in Utah, but my kids did because we lived in Ohio and Michigan. And you're looking for things for your kids to do. And we can still sing one of the songs, which was, follow me, and be a disciple. I will make you fishers of men. It's a great song. Great for primary next year. So, Genesis 1 is also one of those chapters that you may not want to discuss with everybody because it has mysteries connected with it. And Weinrib pointed a lot of those out, and it's fascinating reading. But if you just know light, water, land, and seed, he says this is just the intro to introduce you to the 3 patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And these 3 ideas will be the central focus of the stories that are told. Not all of their story is told, right? The authors and editors of the biblical text, now, if you were an Orthodox Jew, you believe that was from God's mouth to Moses at the time he gets the Ten Commandments. He gets the entire Torah, all 5 books of Moses, delivered to him. Now, what he thought about the end of Deuteronomy where he's dead and they can't find his body. Now that fits in great with Mormon Midrash, right, about Moses. But we look at it and say there is an author. The books were collected together and edited down like Mormon did in the Book of Mormon. He took all those histories of all those wars and edited them down following a pattern. I think he got that pattern from the Book of Judges, which in Jewish tradition was written by Samuel. Because 13 times in the Book of Judges, it follows a pattern. The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. The Lord sends an enemy to attack them. The children of Israel are humbled and pray to God for deliverance, and he sends a deliverer to get them out of captivity. 13 times. And I think that then Mormon, in reading that on the brass plates, would have said, that's a really good idea. I'm going to come up with what the cycle is in our history, and so he goes through that pride cycle, right? How many times do they go through the pride cycle? And it doesn't take many years for each one. And I think that noticing editing and what is said versus what is not said becomes important in understanding the text. Okay? So, in what way is the theme of light in the story of Abraham? Give me examples of where light is important in Abraham's life.
Sacrificing Isaac.
Good. You got the fire on that altar. Well, ultimately, maybe a fire. Not while Isaac's on the altar, but yes.
Sees visions of the stars.
Yes, God takes him out in chapter 15 and says, count the stars, or tell the stars. Any others? Where does he come from? Or, which is this word for light, okay? It's a major theme in the life of Abraham. Light. Isaac. You're hard-pressed to find a major theme in the life of Isaac, who is blind by the end of the book. But probably 14 times you see the word well. And there are arguments going on. This is kind of like Abraham and Lot, where their herdsmen are arguing with each other over the water rights. And so Abram says to Lot, pick where you want to go. And so Lot chooses. What direction does Lot go? East. He goes east. Abram stays around Beersheba and Hebron, which is south of Jerusalem, but in the middle of what is now Israel. And where did we see east? Pay attention in these stories to who is traveling east and who is traveling west. Because that's what chapter 2 through 4 was saying. Pay attention to this. This is a theme. Watch for this. Okay? So Isaac, there's lots and lots and lots of wells, like Beersheba. He settles at Beer Lahai Roi. they argue about wells, and they argue about wells over and over and over. And generally speaking, you skip those parts, right? I don't know that any of you had discussions about water rights in gospel doctrine this year. Does it matter? Oh yeah, we live in Utah. Do your water rights matter?
Oh, yeah.
We've got court cases going on about who has rights. And I think my favorite is a group who say, look, you determine water rights by who first claimed usage. That's part of this midrash. So who first claimed the water in Utah? The lake did. The Great Salt Lake. And so there's this concept that the lake has rights to the water. And that we have not been legally using the water. We use more than we're allowed to, and as a result, what's happening to the lake?
Going down.
Drying up, and it's going to kill us all. Right, the toxic wastes around that lake. This is very much the story of the Dead Sea and where Lot settles and why his wife turns to a pillar of salt. These are not new issues. And the Bible might talk about them in ways that we should think about because that's important. How did we feel about getting 3,000 new families in Salem? The big question you ask is, what water are they going to be using? And the answer was, oh, we have the water rights for the land that BYU Dairy was on. There's plenty of water. And the farmers who surround that piece of land said, plenty of water? Do you know how many feet the wells have dropped in the last 10 years? We have had to put in extra drilling and extra pumps in order to get the water we're allowed. And now you're putting in 3,000 families who are going to water their lawns? This is insane in Utah. I don't know if you do any gardening or are part of any gardening groups, but Utah State is sending out messages saying, please reconsider what you're doing this summer with water. Maybe consider taking out your lawn. Just get rid of it. That is the #1 usage of water in households. There are other people who use more, like growing alfalfa, but that's another issue.
And Rebecca,
Yes,
and the
but
church,
this is a judge who knows what's going on.
It's a water law judge, actually.
the church is now the largest contributor to the water rights that the Great Salt Lake needs back. And the church is gathering up the water rights that are not being used by the church and donating them in large hundreds of thousands of acre feet back to the state
Back
for the Great Salt Lake.
to the lake.
Yeah.
I think that's great theologically.
Yeah.
And how much do we use the lawn outside this building? Okay, right next to where we have the picnic table. I've seen people playing whatever that volleyball game is with a balloon, water balloon or something, you know, and there's 9 squares and they, okay, you might need 20 or 30 feet of lawn, but you don't use the rest. Why do we have it? And so in new buildings, the church is not putting in lawns. I don't know if they're going to retrofit and go back and rip out our lawn. They might, and that's a great idea. We might want to pay attention to what the prophets are saying and doing. Is that an interesting concept, to actually pay attention to what the prophet? Yeah. Okay, so that's water and Isaac. What about Jacob? With land, in particular, land animals, from this column, and seed, in particular males and females. Does that have anything to do with the story of Jacob? It is everything to do with Jacob. And when Jacob, he heads east. When he finally turns around and comes west, he's got so much stuff, hundreds and hundreds of head of each kind of animal. And enough wives and kids, he's willing to give most of them up. Right? You've watched when he's going back to meet Esau. How does he order his family?
Women and children first.
And particular women, it's the handmaidens. They and their kids go first. Well, after the slaves. The slaves go first. But then the handmaidens and their kids. And then Leah and her 6 sons. And finally, the very last one is Rachel and Joseph. Okay, how do the brothers feel about this? Who's setting this family up for disaster? So, the creation story is talking about the creation of the house of Israel. And before this, we go from the first person out to lots of people, and then we get the flood. And so it collapses again, and you get the same storyline of light and water above and water below, and the land and the animals and dry land and etc. as you come out again, and then the whole story collapses again in chapter 11 down to just Abraham. Now, is anybody else righteous and a member of the church, as we would say it, at the time of Abraham? Sure. You meet Melchizedek, and yet we don't follow his story. We know more about Melchizedek in the Book of Mormon than in the Old Testament. Great, the phone that's recording. Okay. So remembering that there's other people out there, noticing them is something we really don't do. We just narrow focus down on Abraham, and then Isaac, and then Jacob. And that is a very important loss in how we see the works of God with humanity. So let me just read what I wrote here. We'll see how this goes. As I reread the stories of Sarah and Eleazar, that's Abram's servant that he sends to get a wife for his son, and Rebecca and Rachel and Leah, I noticed a couple of things this time in reading in here. And if you want to look at my book, you'll find I'm writing all kinds of stuff in the margins that I may not have noticed before. Number one, we need some good art. I was looking for pictures of Leah and Rachel to put up in my primary room. I have, you can understand this. They've got Old Testament. What do I have at the front of the primary room? The Old Testament timeline, of course. And each week I put up another piece of the timeline with paintings around it and talk about that person or place. And there were no paintings of Rachel and Leah in any of, and how many boxes of pictures do I have ready? 10? You know the blue box that used to hold all 500 and something pictures? I have 10 of those. And not a single picture of Rachel and Leah. What does that say about women in the church?
Less important.
If they are not seen, then they are certainly not heard. And this is one of the reasons why there is a push to create more representational art. Now, a lot of it, it's been really interesting. A place called the Compass Gallery in Provo often has the artists come in and show their work. And a big focus has been on maybe we should portray Jesus with the ethnicity he probably had, which means have him look Jewish, which in his day means he's got a natural tan and black curly hair. I mean, that's just a given, those two. How tall he is, who knows? But he is not a red-headed, blue-eyed Northern European. Okay? And yet, look at our art. How we represent him looking like us, or how the church looked for the first 150 years. It's not how the church looks anymore. And perhaps we need to be more historically oriented into what the historical people would have looked like. Now, there's people not comfortable with that. Okay, second, some of the choices and actions of the matriarchs and their sons, and I might say their husbands, are clearly questionable. That's putting it mildly, right? Then, it occurred to me for the very first time that none of those women do we know were members of the covenant in terms of being a member of the church, or necessarily believers in the one true God. Okay? Abram leaves his father's house. Now, the book of Abraham says he left. It's so much, it's incredible understatement. I found it was necessary that I find another place of residence. And why is that? Because Dad's trying to kill me, right? How many of these other individuals come from similarly dysfunctional families? What is Rebecca's brother Laban like? When Rachel leaves home, what does she take with her? The family gods. They are not born in the covenant, members of the church raised with primary and seminary and completely convinced of what is the way you should act in the world. But we assume that. And that does them a disservice because we assume they are acting on the kind of knowledge we have, having been to the temple and made covenants there. I doubt seriously that when these women married into Abram's family, they had any idea of what they were getting into theologically. Okay? Even Abraham, all of them were raised in non-member homes with noticeably different values and ethics. And those cultural differences are going to show up in the lives of the children. Now, for 25 years, we lived in a small ward in Ohio. 2 couples in that ward, okay, not even 2. 2 couples were raised in the church. One of them, her mother joined the church when she was young, but she was not born a member of the church. In the entire ward, Randy and I were about the only people born in the covenant and raised with all the advantages that the church offers its membership. And so we were continually dealing with issues that you would probably not find, hopefully, in my naive 20-something brain at the time. Oh, these things don't happen in LDS homes. There isn't child abuse, there isn't spousal abuse, there isn't deception and theft and immorality in LDS homes, right? Okay, we've grown up. But we certainly noticed, that person in teaching primary is really Catholic. And this one is very much a Methodist in the songs that they chose to have us sing. And you could tell how they were raised as kids, even though they had joined the church. I mean, it says in the scriptures, the sins of the parents are on the heads of the children for 4 generations. And our families, we're at about the 4th or 5th generation members of the church. Expectations in our home are not the same as they are in the homes around us. And that is true of Rebecca and Sarah and Rachel and Leah and Jacob and Abraham, probably Isaac. We need to change how we judge these people. By what standard? So, what I did is called a close reading. And that means you're going to pay attention to everything you possibly can, including, if you have the apparatus to do it, repetition of Hebrew words or the use of unusual Hebrew words in their story. I realize not everybody can do that, but if you can, you're going to see things no one else is seeing. Right now, BYU is producing a series of 27 books. It's called the BYU New Testament Commentary. And they're doing a volume of commentary on each volume of the New Testament. Some are spectacularly good. The book on Mark by Julie Smith, you should buy. It's probably the best scriptural commentary anyone has written in the church. Eric Huntsman is doing a great job. It's taking him forever because he's been living in Israel and other things, but he's doing the book of John. I'm really looking forward to that because he was a Greek scholar before he came to teaching theology, right? And that changes how he's able to read the text. Here's the problem. Most of the men, and other than Julie Smith, I believe they're all men, who are doing the commentaries, the majority of them do not read Greek. So they have someone else do the new translation, and then they pull on mostly LDS sources for their commentary. Okay, but you're not going to get the same insights as if you personally have translated that from the Greek. So I'm looking forward to those that can. Michael Rhodes can, he's good. So you want to look for things like changes in order, unusual words or repetition of words, direction, things we usually slip right past. So, for example, in chapter 11, Terah had lived 70 years in Ur, and then he takes his 3 sons, listed Abraham, Nahor, and Haran, off to what becomes known as Haran. Now, those 2 are not spelled the same, by the way. The name is Haran, and the city is Haran, or vice versa. I'd have to look. But they sound alike. That may be why he chose to settle there. Why did some of us move to Salem? City of peace and beauty, or what? No, that's Kirtland, isn't it? That one's Kirtland, yeah. So the question is, what order were these sons born? Are they triplets? Well, we find out that Haran has at least 3 kids, and his 2 brothers haven't even married yet, that we're aware of. And so when Haran dies, Abram and Nahor take on the responsibility for Haran's children, which is what you do in ancient societies. It's what you do if you become a Mason. I don't know if you knew that. That's the heart and soul of Masonry, was we are going to take care of each other's sons. Who will take care of the orphaned son is one of the statements that apparently Joseph Smith said as he was being shot by other Masons. Calling out, saying, excuse me, this is a mutual protection society and a mutual help organization that if I die, you're going to make sure that my orphans and my wife are taken care of. That's why you joined this group. Because there was no societal safety net. None. Kind of like we're trying to get rid of the safety nets now. So Lot, whose name, or Lot in Hebrew, his name means muffled, covered up, covert, or secret. That's a strange name. Abram takes him on. Nahor then marries Haran's daughter Milcah, which means queen. Melech is king, right? MLK, Martin Luther King, king, Melech, Melchizedek, Melchizedek. If you put the feminine ah at the end, Milcah, you get queen or kingdom. They are the same word. Because how do you get a kingdom as a king? It's through your queen, right? That's the given. And Abram marries Sarai, whose name means my princess. Now the problem is that the text said that that Haran had 2 daughters, Milcah and Iscah. Who is Iscah? Why is no one taking care of Iscah? She disappears. And in the very next line, Abram is marrying Sarai. Well, who's Sarai? And then he claims that she's a sister or a close relative, and yet she's not in the genealogy. Now, women normally aren't, right? I really love that. That the genealogies start off with, these are the generations of Noah, or whatever, right? This is the genealogy of Shem. These are the generations of Shem. That's where we find out about this family. And the word generations, if you've been in the class before, you know, toldot, is from the verb yeled, which means to give birth. And generally speaking, no one in those lists have given birth. Now we're getting down to possible births, but we're also told Sarai is barren. Before she ever gets married, everybody already knows she's barren. Now, how does that happen? Well, that's one of the questions the rabbis will ask. And so you get Midrash to fill in the answer to that story. Okay? And there's 2 possibilities, and one I'd never heard of before, so that was a new one. Was Sarah married previously? and sent home by her husband because within the first 10 years of their marriage, she never gave him a son. And that is the legal right and is written into every ketubah, wedding document, writing. It says, if you are unable to bear sons, I can send you home and I get my money back. And that's literally how it works. He had to pay a bride price to her family, and if she does not bear sons, they get their money back. Can you even imagine how embarrassing that is to a girl? So that's one option. Option two is that Sarah is amenorrheic, or Sarai, which means she doesn't have periods. Now in our society, okay, maybe your mom knows. Maybe she's taken you to a doctor and he knows. Odds are your older brothers don't know. Certainly the neighbors don't know. But in this ancient society, there are customs associated with puberty, both for men and for women. And one was that girls who begin menstruating are expected to cover their hair. So you start wearing a head covering. That's one. So if you never put on that head covering, what's with this girl? Now, why would Abram choose to marry a woman who was barren? Now, something to keep in mind is he hasn't, as far as we know, he hasn't had a bunch of conversations with God. He hasn't been offered the new and everlasting covenant yet. That happens in chapter 12, the next verse. And this is chapter 11. So what are Abram's expectations? What is he doing? And one source that I was reading said, Abram is acting nobly. He is taking on a woman who has been orphaned because, according to the Midrash, Iscah is Sarai. It's a different name for her. Iscah, and this is in the Talmud, so it's kind of canonized Midrash. It's kind of like how people used to read Mormon doctrine as if it was actually Mormon doctrine, right? So Iscah, her name could mean, and these are just some that are from the same verbal base, teacher, anointed, having secret knowledge, enclosed or protected, because it's the same word as sukkah, which is the tent that you put up at the Feast of Tabernacles, or booths. That's a sukkah. It is the Feast of Sukkot, and this is Iscah. So, and the rabbis will say, this is a woman who had secret knowledge, had been anointed with the Spirit and was a prophetess, and Abram recognized her value. That's a great midrash. I like that midrash. So, when Haran, by the way, means hot, dry, angry, a burning place. They're living essentially in Utah. And when Abram leaves there, the rest of the family stays, Nahor and Dad. And the dad will live for another 70 years after Abram leaves. And Nahor is going to then, after he marries Milcah, they have a son named Bethuel. And Bethuel has two kids, Laban and Rebekah. And they have been raised in Haran. And Grandpa is an idolater. We know that from even the book of Abraham, right? He also is so into that idolatry that he's willing to offer up his son as an offering to other gods. That's the home, and it's in a region of Syria called Aram. And so you are going to hear about Haran and Padan Aram, which is the area of Syria that the city of Haran is in. So people will say, well, where do they live? Do they live in Haran or do they live in Padan Aram? And that's like saying, so do you live in Salem or do you live in Utah? Okay, yeah. Now, Padan sounds a lot like Pada, which means to ransom or redeem. And yet we don't see much ransoming or redeeming going on in Nahor or Terah's families. So I noticed that there were unexpected reversals and foreshadowings that I hadn't necessarily paid attention to before. When the Lord calls to Abram, he uses a phrase, Lech Lecha. And those, it means going, go. Or, as the rabbis will say, go to yourself and go. And so they'll talk about how Abram is becoming more authentically who he's supposed to be when God calls him to leave. But we're going to watch that Lech show up in almost everybody else's story. Go. Get up and go. And the question is, which way do they go? What direction does Abram go when he leaves Haran? He heads west into the promised land. And that matters. Now, we are not told why the Lord called him in the Old Testament. You get in other pieces of the story in the book of Abraham. But as I indicated, that's kind of Mormon Midrash. So nobody else has those stories. So if you're just doing a close reading of the biblical text, it raises questions in your head that are not the questions that are being asked in gospel doctrine, because we also are doing the reading from the book of Abraham. And it's already answered the questions. So we don't have to ask those questions. I think we should ask more questions. Everywhere that Abram goes, he either builds an altar, or he sets up a pillar, or he camps and stays by great big named trees. When it says that Abram is on the plains of Moreh, it's not plains, it's a terebinth, or a type of oak tree. And you say, well, there's a difference between camping under a really big 200-year-old tree and the way the artist depicted is he's out on empty plains in his tent. And the trees are named because they don't have a lot of trees in Israel. Honestly, one of the greatest tragedies was back in about 2013. They had been planting trees, hundreds of thousands of trees every year, in an effort to change the ecology in Israel. What do trees do? They evaporate moisture into the air and oxygen, just, a side thing there that we might need. But if you plant millions of trees, it cools the temperature down and it raises the amount of precipitation that you have. Israel needs that. So they have national forests where they have been planting trees like crazy. And one of the great tragedies was the forest fire that started in one of those national forests. And an entire bus full of firefighters got caught by the fire and killed. But they are planting trees like crazy. One of the laws that you'll see in the book of Leviticus is do not cut down your enemy's trees. You're an idiot if you cut down people's trees, because how many years is it going to take before you get apples again? Or how many years is it going to be before you get olives? How many years does it take to get the first grapes? I mean, think about this in the story of Noah. The story is that the wind comes and blows over the water and it dries out and you're on dry land. I hope you see that in this. Here you've got the Spirit hovering over the waters, right? And then you have the separation of the waters above from the waters below. When the rain stops and the fountains of the deep quit spewing forth water in the story. And then that Spirit or wind blows on the waters and the dry land appears. And Noah gets off the ark, picks grapes, makes wine, and gets drunk, all in one sentence. And we all know it takes at least 3 to 4 years before you get any fruit. You know, you might get 4 or 5 grapes, but it'll take a while. That changes that story. Okay? You're not allowed to cut down the trees, because then what good is the land? What was the war for if you're not taking over their vineyards and their orchards? Going in and destroying a place is just stupid. We have not learned that. So, Abram gets into this beautiful place, camps under trees, which the King James translators are really uncomfortable with, because in the English heritage, they had this issue of the Druids and sacred trees. And we don't want people to think that we, enlightened people in the 17th century, 1600s, time of Shakespeare, believe that there are sacred trees. Okay, then you're going to have to change the text, and so they do. And then famine hits. Now, that does not sound like the promised land that God promised to Abram. That you're going to go into this land, which other people are living on, and then famine hits. And so they go down into Egypt. Who else has a famine and goes into Egypt? Right, his grandson. And Abram is afraid he's going to be killed by Pharaoh. We have somebody who Pharaoh is killing all the males. The female then, who is associated with Pharaoh, is going to get a son, but not give birth to him, right? Gets him out of the river. This is Pharaoh's daughter and Moses. What happens in Abraham's family? Sarah gives, according to the Midrash, Hagar is Pharaoh's daughter. And Sarah knows she can't have kids, so she has Pharaoh's daughter bear a child so that she, a princess, and we always think of Pharaoh's daughter as kind of a princess down there getting Moses out of the water, gets a son who's not hers. And in the process, Egypt gets hit with plagues. This is Abraham's day when he takes Sarah, Pharaoh takes Sarah into his household. Because what did Abram say? Tell them you're my sister. Because if you're my sister, you're still available to maybe marry. And they will pay me good money to get my sister. Especially if she's beautiful. And the midrash is that Sarah is the most beautiful woman who ever lived, even when she's 100 years old. Okay, this explains why all these men want Sarah. Okay, it's hilarious. But Pharaoh gets plagued by God because of what he's doing to Sarah. And we don't know if he did anything, but he certainly took her away from Abraham. Do we see later plagues? How do the Israelites leave Egypt? Wealthy. How does Abram leave Egypt? Wealthy. And they take with them, in both stories, a daughter of Pharaoh. According to the Midrash, Hagar is a daughter of Pharaoh, of Egyptian princess. What Egyptian princess left in the Exodus story? Moses' mom. She goes with him. The daughter of Pharaoh leaves. She takes a new name. Her new name is Bithia, which means daughter of Jehovah. Has she converted? And she marries an Israelite and has kids. And we don't notice that parallel as to why they say that Hagar is an Egyptian princess, because it needs to foreshadow this later Egyptian princess in their story. But how honest was Abram? You'll notice he's not as concerned about what happens to Sarah in Pharaoh's house as what will happen to him. Now, that's not usually what we talk about with Abraham. What we do know is that Abram is extremely generous. So we get these radically different perspectives on Abram. When he and Lot get back, and it doesn't say he took Lot with him into Egypt, but he must have, rather than leave the kid alone. Who knows how old Lot was. They get back into the southern part of Judah, and there's just not enough land and water for all of their flocks and herds. And so they have this conversation about, Lot, where do you want to live? Look, you can either go to the left hand and go north and take all of Judah, or the other direction is east, which at that time was like the Garden of God. That's how they describe, like Eden is where Sodom is. And so Lot chooses that more Edenic land and ends up getting exiled out of that land. And there's death in his family and other problems. And notice, what direction is Lot going? He's going east. You get to chapter 14, where Abram is called upon to rescue Lot, who, because he's living amongst all these wealthy people on land that is great, other kings come in and say, we want this land, and so they go in and attack and take all of the four kings take all of the land and people. Well, they can't take the land with them, but they certainly take the people and all their stuff with them and head north, all the way up to Dan now, or into Damascus and that area of Syria. It says they go as far north as Dan. Dan is Abram's grandson. So names may be, and places may be anachronistically used. Okay? don't think that the town was already named Dan. That's the name it gets after the 12 tribes come back from Egypt. And that part of the country is given to the tribe of Dan. So you have to kind of keep a timeline going in your head of, all right, that's out of place. So Abram shows up and goes off to rescue Lot because that's what he's obligated to do. This is his nephew, his dead brother's son. He's got to take care of him. That's his obligation. And so he gets together all those 318 men in his household, and off they go. And they win the battle against the 5 kings, and they return with lots of stuff. I don't know if you picture Abraham as a warrior. At the head of an army. That is not our usual view of Abraham. Or Abram at this point. He meets Melchizedek, who is priest of the Most High God, and that should be jarring to you that there are other people out there worshiping the Most High God besides Abram. The Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews all believe that Abraham is the first monotheist. Mormons don't. We think Adam was the first monotheist, but in a very generous definition of monotheism, right? We don't want to define ourselves as polytheistic, although the word is Elohim, plural. Now, there's only 2 places in Torah. Now, this is not the whole Old Testament, but in the 5 books of Moses, now that I think about it, there's only one that ever mentions Salem, and that's this occasion. So in all the writings of Moses, this is the only mention of Salem. And Jerusalem doesn't exist yet. So that's later. Now, we all believe that Salem is Jerusalem, is where the temple is going to be built, and thus it's holy land, but that's not a given at the time. And tithes, Abram is paying tithes. Now, in the later law of Moses, where do you pay tithes? To your local bishop? It goes to the temple, which puts Salem and Melchizedek into a temple context. But we really don't know what's already there. Okay. So, Genesis 15, Abram is again promised without any obligations back. When we think of covenant, we think, we promise to do this and God promises us this. That's not, the only thing that Abram really has to promise is that he will not go to war for some other god. That's faithful to that God as a warrior. And so the covenant, you'll notice, different from Noah, where the covenant is first mentioned. In Noah, it says, I offer this covenant to you and your wife and your sons and their wives. God never mentions Sarah in the covenant in chapter 15 or 12. We assume Sarah is part of it, but it's never mentioned. And Abram says, I am childless. He doesn't say we are childless. And repeatedly through the story, he will say, I have no son. What are your promises to me? Do you see that this Abram that we saw in Egypt isn't the only time we see him as focused on what do I need? And at the same time, He's the guy who welcomes the 3 visitors to his tent and feeds them well. He's known for his great hospitality. God had, and that's actually chapter 18. So we have to go back to 16, where the promise in 15 was, your heir will be one coming from your own loins, a son that you will sire. And we think, Isaac. That is also true of Ishmael. And in a very real way, chapter 16, when Abram goes in unto Hagar and she conceives and bears him a son, that can be seen and was seen by Abraham as fulfillment of the covenant. And when it comes time to do circumcision in chapter 17, he circumcises Ishmael. And he sees Ishmael, his firstborn, as his firstborn, who's going to inherit everything. But that's not what God is seeing. But do you see how we just don't pay any attention to how Abraham feels about Ishmael? And there's this major reversal between these 2 princesses here, right? In the Midrash, Hagar is a princess and Sarah is a princess, and they just changed positions. Hagar was a slave. Now she is the mother of the firstborn son. That gives you all the status. And Sarai is still a barren woman. And you can see, how many years is this? It's almost 90 years that Sarai has been barren in her society, which means you have no value whatsoever. So when she gets annoyed with Hagar, there's background. She's got baggage. And you have to cut her some slack, because Hagar is probably strutting her stuff and is really pleased to be in a position of authority now. So Sarai becomes the oppressor of the Egyptian. Whoa, that's not how the story goes. The Egyptians oppress the Israelites, right? The Israelites are made into slaves. But in this story, the slave is elevated, and the Egyptian is being oppressed by Sarah. I think that's fascinating. When Hagar leaves, so she leaves as a slave out into the wilderness. And who does she meet in the wilderness? She meets God and an angel. And she names the place Bir Lahi Roi, which is the well of the living God who sees, or who sees me, or who I saw. Hebrew is so ambiguous. Good luck with that. Well, that sounds more like Moses going into the wilderness and seeing God, and God makes water come out of a rock miraculously, and here she is at a well. Do you see the foreshadowing going on in the way the story's told? Unusually, the slave is told to return and submit. Now, last 2 weeks, we were talking about a group who are known for their submission, right? Islam, which is through Hagar and her descendants. Hagar is the first to submit. And I don't know if you noticed that term. In chapter 17, you get circumcision and the change of the names. of Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah, and that's where God, I assume, tells Abram that he's going to have a son through Sarah. This is the first time that we hear that Sarah is going to have any kids. And Abram's reaction is, he laughs. And then in the next chapter, when Sarah hears this promise repeated again, when the three men come to meet Abram, she laughs. And God says, hey, Sarah, why are you laughing? And she's like embarrassed and lies. I didn't laugh. And we all point that out. But what we don't notice is that Abram laughed first. And why is everybody laughing? Because that's Isaac's name. His name, Yitzhak, is laughter. And so when he is named, this is who you're going to have, is Yitzhak, the response is you're going to laugh. And why are they laughing? Because it's impossible. You've got to be kidding. Or they laugh at his weaning because it's such an incredible moment. It's the joy. So it's a two-sided kind of laughter. In the next chapter, well, when the three men are there, two of them head off toward Sodom, and Abraham and God, apparently, are having a conversation. And Abraham looks at God and says, I'm sorry, I thought I knew you, but would you destroy an entire city? What if there are any righteous people in that city? Maybe there's 50 righteous people there. Would you destroy the entire place? That's like, I don't know, bombing a girls' school. Why would you do that? So God says, okay, I won't. And then he says, well, 45. What if there's 45? Maybe 40, 30, 20. And he gets down to 10 and stops. And God says, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy the city. And I thought, who are the 10? Because Abram stops at 10. So you've got Lot, who's living there, and his wife, 2 unmarried daughters. They're problematic in the story. Well, so is Lot, problematic in the story. But the 2 unmarried daughters. You have sons-in-law, plural. So you got at least 2 other married daughters and their husbands, and then Abram or Lot's sons. So the people that we've just mentioned add up to 10. And it's like Abram's assumption is that Lot and his children are righteous and that they can save the city. Now, this is what the Jews will call judging righteous judgment, where you assume people are righteous. That's your first judgment call. Not that they're wicked. And that's hard to do sometimes when you're driving on I-15. You have to assume they have a reason to cross 4 lanes of traffic all at once to get off that exit. I don't know. Anyway, that's called judging righteous judgment, is looking for a righteous reason for someone to be doing what they're doing. And he assumes that Lot and his family are righteous. But when the 2 messengers arrive there, we find out that's not the case at all. And Lot's sons and his sons-in-law, they're not willing to leave town. Lot is not willing to leave town. The messengers have to grab Lot and his wife and his 2 unmarried daughters by the hand and drag them out of the city. None of them are interested in leaving. And then we all dump blame on Lot's wife because the messenger said, don't return. Oh, interesting. What direction do you think they're going when they leave Sodom? West. Okay? So don't return means not just don't turn around and go back east, but it means don't go back to the sins, right? Now, Lot's wife stops and turns around and looks back. Why do you think she might do that?
Because I was home.
It was home, and who is there?
Grandkids.
Grandkids.
That's right.
I mean, the reality is, you got your husband over here, you got grandkids over there. I'm sorry, who would you rather be with? We all know grandma's gonna choose those grandkids. And yet, we judge Lot's wife as wanting to return to the corruption that's in Sodom. And instead, maybe we should judge that there's people there she loves. And it's home. And different people respond to disaster in different ways. We've watched a couple of disaster movies lately. One was a volcano and earthquake, and it's going to put out a tidal wave, you know, those kinds of stories. And there's a couple of guys who say, good time to die. And there's other people who are desperately trying to get together with family. Well, what if those choices, what if getting together with family means I need to go where I'm going to die? And that's what Lot's wife is confronted with, that she can't choose these 3 verses, those 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, who knows how many, back in the city. And of course, this story, most biblical scholars will say, is to explain the presence of the pillars of salt that are in the area where the Dead Sea used to be and where Sodom and Gomorrah once was, and climate change has wreaked havoc with the place, in Great Salt Lake, and you're left with just pillars of salt and toxic waste. And so this story is told that she turns into a pillar of salt. Does she? I mean, it's kind of like, point in the right direction, that's Princess Timpanogos laying on the top of the mountain, right? And we go and see her heart in the cave. We still tell these stories to explain what we see around us. Now, Abram's hospitality, welcoming strangers, is contrasted with Sodom and Gomorrah's lack of hospitality, not just the other things we think of with Sodom, but Ezekiel will say in chapter 16, verse 45, I will read that to you. I don't think I marked it. But this, I think, is a more what God had in mind. Now, Ezekiel 16 is one of my favorite chapters. It's just that halfway through it kind of turns dark. And this is part of the dark part of chapter 16, where it's talking about the city of Sodom and Gomorrah as a woman. And it's verse 46 and 49. And your sister in Samaria, she and her sisters that dwell at your left hand, this is talking to Judah as a city, and the 10 tribes of Israel are farther north, that's in Samaria on the left. they're at your left hand, and your younger sister, she dwells at your right hand. That's Sodom and her daughters. Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom: pride, fullness of bread, abundance of idleness in her and her daughters. But neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and the needy, but they were haughty. So the complaint against Sodom, at least by the prophets, is they had plenty of everything. And they didn't use it to help anybody. And God will take that just so long, and then he cuts off the rain. So the question is, who else are we going to see that seems to have plenty of everything but doesn't want to share it? And I hope that your mind goes to Laban. When Jacob shows up there. Laban wants to keep everything. Those are my daughters, those are my animals you're taking with you, he says. And he just doesn't see that he should be sharing anything with anybody. Now, let me just close with, these are the traditions about Sarah in the Midrash. All of these are Midrash. None of this is biblical. But essentially everything that the Jews have to say about Sarah makes her look really good. Sarah has prophetic authority. She's one of the 7 prophets because remember, God tells Abraham to do what Sarah says. When the issue is kicking out Ishmael and Hagar the second time. Do what your wife says. Clearly she has insight and prophetic insight. Number 2, that she has quite a spiritual legacy, that Sarah brought thousands of women into the faith, belief in the one true God in her tent. That was her school. That she has miraculous protection, that when she is abducted by Pharaoh and later Abimelech, God steps in to protect her from any possible harm. The significance of her tent is that it is viewed almost as a temple, a sanctuary. It has a cloud of glory hovering over it, a light burning inside that lasts from one Shabbat to the next, and the dough, the challah, the bread that she makes for Sabbath. Now, all of this is anachronistic, right? You understand that. They didn't light candles for Sabbath. They didn't make challah at the time. That dough was blessed to always raise and be present, and it never died. And so there's always bread for everybody. Her name is changed. Now that one is true. And this is true. She is buried in the cave of the patriarchs. My concern is that we have a tendency to only tell the stories that make our ancestors and our church leaders look really good. And not necessarily say what is in the text. You'll notice that God comes down on Joseph in the Doctrine and Covenants several times and criticizes him for what he's doing. We need to have a more authentic view of what people are actually like. And if your own life hasn't taught you that people have failings, hopefully, as you read through the biblical text, you'll notice, everybody in here has problems. What a surprise. And yet, what do we do with that text? We tend to gloss right over. Well, the reason he did that was, or the reason she did this is. And we're doing righteous judgment, but it changes who the people actually are. And I hope that this begins to suggest that God works with whatever he can get. And that includes us. And yet, he offers you the everlasting covenant with all your faults. He says, just come west. Just come back. And of course, there's chapter 15 where you have that unconditional God walking twice through the blood path with Abram. If you sin, if I, as God, don't keep my promises, you can cut me off. And if you, Abraham, sin, you can cut me off. And I will be the carcass in your place. And that's our promise, regardless of how perfect or imperfect we are. Because we read that Abram is commanded to be perfect. How does he do with that? The same as we do. Right? And it just requires that turning around every Shabbat, taking the sacrament, and starting over. And that, of course, is the gospel of Jesus Christ in the story of Abraham. And I leave that with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Question, Rebecca?
Yeah.
Will you clarify the thing you said about Joseph Smith when he was shot? What he said, were the mob members Masons?
Apparently, I mean, there are those who say that there were members of the mob who were Masons. Apparently, it was a pretty popular group to be a part of, especially in frontier America where anything can happen to you. And so you're asking the people in the community to take care of your wives and your wife and your sons and daughters if you die.
And so Joseph said, "Oh Lord my God."
Well, there's some question as to whether he said, "Oh Lord my God," which may be a Masonic phrase. I don't know all the Masonic phrases. Or if he cries out, "I am the widow's son.
I'm what?
I am the widow's son.
Oh.
Who will care for the widow's son?" So,
Thank you.
it's one or the other. There's some good books on Masonry and Joseph Smith. That could answer the question.